The struggle for reforms, which are improvements in the conditions of workers under capitalism, has always been a key part of the Marxist movement. However, Marxists see this struggle as the path through which the working class gets organized and realizes its power, not the end goal, which is a socialist revolution. In Germany during the 1910s, a revisionist tendency within the German Social Democrats, centered around a man called Edward Bernstein, began to suggest that the social democracy should limit itself to the struggle for reforms rather than for revolution. He argued that in this way, socialists could gradually transform society. Rosa Luxemburg, a revolutionary who was also a member of the German Social Democrats at the time, argued in her book Reform or Revolution that the ideas of reformism reflected the petty bourgeois nature of the academics and theoreticians in the party apparatus. They wished to make concessions to the bosses and ultimately throw out class struggle in favor of collaboration. Now, one of the key ideas of Marxism is that capitalism periodically goes into economic crisis. These are sometimes deep general crises that place the whole system at risk. However, Bernstein rejected this, arguing that the capitalist system can adapt itself and get rid of the possibility of crisis. This removes part of the scientific basis of socialism, the fact that contradictions are inherent in the capitalist system. Take that away, and socialism becomes just a nice idea rather than a historical necessity. Bernstein argued that this struggle for economic reforms and improvements in workers' conditions can eventually result in the socialist transformation of society. However, under capitalism, reforms have a very limited character. Although the organized trade union movement can try to defend the rights of workers, this is ultimately limited to the struggle for increased wages, reducing the working day and preventing layoffs where possible. This does not in any way challenge the exploitation which is inherent to the capitalist system. It can regulate the exploitation, but does not transform the process of production itself. Further, when the state implements labour legislation, it's hardly acting in the defence of workers. Social reforms enacted by the state are in the interests of preserving capitalism, even if it mildly inconveniences capitalists in the short term. Therefore, as capitalism goes through crisis, the trade union movement often finds itself on the back foot. Rather than being able to seize the moment to transform society, the part of the labour movement which limits itself to reforms must fight a defensive struggle, trying to prevent the gains of the past from being reversed. We're seeing this obviously at the moment with the current fire and rehire tactic that's been used across the labour movement, with British gas workers being fired for refusing to take worse conditions for less pay. To make up for the losses on the market, the capitalists try even harder to attack wages and conditions. The state also rolls back social reforms to give the capitalists more ability to make profits. The solution to this is not to limit ourselves to the struggle for reforms, but to fight politically for the overthrow of capitalism. This does not mean that these reforms are not worth fighting for, but they will not automatically lead us to socialism. An example of this is in the post war period in Britain through to the 1970s. We saw probably the greatest amount of reforms ever in this country's history, won by the working class. The creation of the NHS, the welfare state, housing programs. We talk about the post war period as a sort of golden period for the working class in which they made huge advances and reforms. But those reforms were only granted because you were in a historic upswing of capitalism. That mixed with a powerful labour movement meant that those reforms could be granted. But then in the 1970s, you obviously have a global recession and you get crisis within the capitalist system. Within the 70s, you get the first miners' strike in 1974, which successfully brings down the Edward Heath government because of the Industrial Relations Act, which was going to seriously hamper the ability to strike and picket. After that, you get the winter of discontent, where the Labour government tried to enact pay freezes and deductions on the working class. And the Labour movement wasn't having this. The trade union movement refused to go along with it. And so there was a split within them. And at a time when the working class and the Labour movement should have been considering to take over the levers of the economy, they instead went to the IMF and asked for a bailout loan and implemented essentially a form of austerity measures. Because of their inability to then take over the heights of the economy and put in place a centrally planned economy under workers' democracy, you get a split within the Labour movement. You get the election of Thatcher in 1979. Thatcher then obviously comes in and brings in sweeping reforms, which we sort of term neoliberalism, huge amounts of privatization, deregulation, basically undoing all of the reforms won in the post war period in essentially a decade. This again wasn't a foregone conclusion, though, as the miners' strike in 1984 nearly defeated Thatcher, but was isolated because of a lack of solidarity from other trade unions. The TUC famously had promised after Scargill in 1984 there would be solidarity with the miners, but then they didn't carry through with this. And at the same period, Neil Kinnock was waging a war on the left of the Labour Party, something that we're obviously seeing being replayed today with Starmer. Added to that, today we have 26 billionaires in the world who own more money than the bottom 3.5 billion people. We have 100 companies who are responsible for 70% of all emissions. And we have 10 billion, we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, and yet hundreds of millions of people die of starvation. So, if reforms were taking us towards the promised land of socialism, why have we got such a concentrated amount of wealth? Why have we got such uncontrollable inequality? And why have all the reforms that we were so hard fought and won after the post war period been undone by successive governments who have followed a neoliberal path? In class society, the state is organized to represent the interests of the ruling class. The state will only enact social reforms if they are also in the interest of capitalists. There can be a conflict between the interests of the development of capitalism overall and the interests of the capitalists as individuals or in one country. In this case, the state would take the side of the latter. For example, retaining protectionist policies to protect internal markets. See the vaccine rollout that we've got at the moment. We've bought up 10% of the world's vaccines despite only being 1% of the world's population. This is in order to get the British economy moving as quickly as possible. But because we don't have a global cooperative approach to this, the world market as a whole is still stalled, and we're still seeing huge amounts of debt and also financial downturn on a global scale because of these protectionist measures. As I was saying, as well, they start wars not to spread capitalism, but to defend one group of capitalists against another. So in World War One was a war of imperialist powers. These sort of empires had reached a point where they couldn't grow any further, and so they went to war with each other, not because of any great moral crusade, but because they wanted to see who was going to carve up Africa and who was going to carve up the other colonial parts of the world that were sort of owned by the different parts of the empire. And as you saw after the First World War, the German empire's colonies were divided up between the French, the British, and the Spanish empires. So we can see that the state does not represent the interests of society, but simply narrowly represents the interest of capitalists. Therefore, why would this state ever implement socialism? As Engels pointed out in The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it has to split into irreconcilable antagonisms, which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves in society in a fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power, arisen out of society but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state. Bernstein and the reformists argue that because democracy is now extended to the masses, they will inevitably vote in their own interests, and this can therefore be a gradual way to implement socialism. However, this contradicts the class character of the state, and it contradicts what we know from history. Just look at the lessons from the Corbyn era. On the table, you had a socialist platform, a transformational manifesto, but what happened? You had all of the state basically put against Corbyn. The media, with which the billionaires own, including the BBC, were hugely biased and antagonistic towards Corbyn's Labour. You had intelligence services investigating Corbyn and trying to find out whether he was a Czech spy or whether he once went to the wrong grave in Palestine. You had the right wing of the Labour Party massively undermining and sabotaging his leadership through the chicken coup, through the constantly going to the media and speaking against him. Every element of the state was wielded against Corbyn to prevent him from coming into government, and he so nearly did in 2017 if it wasn't for that sabotage within the Labour Party. And so we can see that people won't just vote their way to socialism because of all of the forces against it, and what the state will wield against it. And so the lesson of that Corbyn era was essentially he should have took a far more firmer line with the right of the party. He should have. Oh, so I got a cup of tea coming in. He should have took a far more firmer line with the right of the Labour Party. He should have democratised it, brought in open selection, in order that you could have cut away the power that was trying to prevent them from coming into leadership. According to Marx, the state is not an organ of reconciliation, but of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of order which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between classes. Although democratic in form, parliament is the instrument of the ruling class. The closer workers get to electing a socialist parliament, the more the illusion of democracy will be sacrificed to maintain the real function of the state. As we're seeing right now, capitalism cannot grant reforms, and so you're getting greater authoritarian measures introduced. Hence why the police and crime bill is being pushed through, because the government knows that if they can't grant reforms, if when this furlough scheme ends in September, millions of people are thrown onto the unemployment pile, there's going to be mass upheaval, mass protest, mass anger that will need to be put down. And the only way they can do that is through increased repression. Because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, but because it arose at the same time in the midst of the conflict of these classes, it is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful economically dominant class, which through the medium of the state becomes also the politically dominant class, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. That's Engels again. The state, a power which arose from society but places itself above it and alienates itself more and more from it, what does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men having prisons, etc., at their command. Reformism sees history as a straight line, as consistent progress as opposed to a struggle based on the contradictions between these class forces. By overlooking this, you overlook the need for revolution and thus condemn society and all its people to toil under the oppressive and exploitive nature of capitalism and class society. As Marxists, we participate in the struggle for social reforms. It is a way to prepare the proletariat for taking power. By contrast, reformists are not interested in taking power, only in creating short-term improvements to the lives of workers within the limitations of capitalism. In other words, Marxists aim to use this struggle to create a subjective factor, an organization of workers willing to overthrow capitalism, while reformists argue that social reforms will objectively bring about an end of capitalism. However, since I've already explained that social reforms on their own do not end capitalism, what are the practical implications of this theory? Socialism will not come about automatically. The objective condition for the overthrow of capitalism is the crisis, the intensification of all the deep contradictions within capitalism. But a subjective factor is required as well. The working class must realize that the only way to get out of these contradictions is by the socialist transformation of society. And how do we build this subjective factor? Right now, there is no mass revolutionary party. We no longer have the great communist and social democratic parties of the early 1900s. So we must work within the mass worker organizations that do exist and win the majority in them over to our ideas. As Trotsky sets out in this method of revolutionary work in his pamphlet, The Transitional Program, what is essentially revolutionaries put forward demands that are agreeable amongst the majority of a mass worker organization. This forces their leaders to challenge capitalists. If they do, great. You then evolve the demand to become more revolutionary. If they do not, the masses see the bankruptcy of their so called leaders, and you push to replace them with new leadership stemming from the masses themselves. What we must not do is set up small sectarian parties on the fringes of politics and expect the masses to come to us, a method that has never worked and will never work. New parties are only created through events, and even then, there has to be a subjective factor, an organized movement within the split that can harness the fallout, as happened in 1931 with Ramsay MacDonald, who joined into a national government with the Tories and forced a split in the Labour Party, which created the Independent Labour Party, which later became the Attlee and Devon government of the post-war period. Reformism is ultimately built on an undialectical and idealistic understanding of capitalism. It does not analyze the capitalist economy, but rather treats every part of the capitalist economy as something separate. This is best seen in Bernstein's argument that the system can just do away with the crisis of overproduction. Overproduction essentially being the fact that capitalism produces more stuff than the working class can buy back. Capitalism, like everything else in the world, is a system which works dialectically, with contradictions, with sort of moving, constantly moving. Every part affects another part. Contradiction flows into each other, with the temporary resolution of one contradiction only leading to the intensification of another. The belief that the capitalist economy can somehow be fixed, and the refusal to prepare the working class for power, means the so-called social democrats and reformists end up moving in the opposite direction, becoming a tool of bourgeois democracy. Rather than helping to bring about socialism, they actively maintain capitalism. Instead of fighting to transform society, reformists suggest we simply politely convince the capitalists to be more just and fair in distributing their profits. Can this be done through democracy? Only if you believe, which reformists do, that democracy is a system that can transcend class antagonisms and unite the nation. This could not be further from the truth. Bourgeois democracy, just like democracy of the ancient Greek slave societies, ultimately represents the interests of the ruling capitalist class. Capitalism and democracy are not intrinsically linked. We see from history that capitalism can use absolute monarchies, totalitarian dictatorships, and even theocracies. While for now in many of the developed capitalist countries, democracy is considered the ideal method of class rule, this can change. In fact, Luxemburg argued that liberalism and democracy were becoming increasingly useless for the German ruling class, in large part due to fear of the growing labor movement. The ruling class would be quick to throw out any democratic concessions they had previously made if this were necessary to prevent communists coming to power. Reformists often claim that revolutionary socialists want to ignore democracy, as if bourgeois democracy is the only possible kind. Yes, bourgeois democracy is a farce, but ultimately the organized working class are the only ones who can defend genuine democracy, the democracy of the vast majority, workers' democracy. And throw out democratic concessions the German ruling class did when calling for war in 1914. And what did the reformists do? To cut a long story short, supported it, sending their own workers to kill workers from other countries, all for the interest of protecting the ruling class of each imperialist nation. This was even more shocking as just 2 years before, during the Second International, which was a grouping of social democratic and communist parties and groups from different countries from all around the world, they were determined to oppose war, and they could have stopped it. They could have called general strikes in all these countries to prevent war from being carried out. This strange chauvinistic attitude couldn't have been further from the international solidarity which socialism was built upon. As Marx said, the workers of the world have no country. Workers of the world unite. Rosa Luxemburg, alongside Karl Liebknecht, formed the Spartacus League in Germany on the anti-war basis. And when the war ended due to the destitution, a revolution broke out. But due to the premature nature of the Spartacus League, now called the KPD German Communist Party, the workers turned to those they were familiar with, the reformist leaders of the Social Democratic Party, who in reaction tried to suppress the revolution, instead setting up a centrist parliament instead for bourgeois capitalism. During this struggle, revolutionaries Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were murdered by the Freikorps, a right-wing militia. The new reformist government went into collaboration with these murderers, consolidated capitalism, which led to hyperinflation and ultimately led to the rise of Hitler in 1933. So the consequence of reformism was the rise of fascism. Reformists argue that legislative change and revolution both achieve the same end, a more equal society, and therefore it is possible to pick and choose between them. But historically, this is not the case. During the development of capitalism out of feudalism, the bourgeoisie could use legislation to gradually strengthen their own position. This didn't replace the necessity of a bourgeois revolution to seize power. It actually laid the way for it. Rather than being some spontaneous, violent, and random outburst, revolution is the motor force of history. Legislative reform and revolution aren't mutually exclusive, they complement each other. Historically, new legal constitutions are often products of a revolution. Revolution is the act of political creation, while legislation is the political expression of the life of a society that has already come into being. This also means that reforms are limited in how far they can go. Legislative reform stays within the framework put in place by the last revolution. Reformists, therefore, are not actually pursuing the same goal as socialists. Instead of socialism, their goal is reformed capitalism. As Rosa Luxemburg says in Reform or Revolution, people who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform in place of and in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and socialist revolution do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they take a stand for surface modifications of the old society. Our program becomes not the realization of socialism, but the reform of capitalism. Not the suppression of the system of wage labor, but the oh man, this is a really difficult word. Diminution of exploitation. That is the suppression of the abuses of capitalism instead of the suppression of capitalism itself. Under capitalism, all of the seeds for a socialist society exist, but they are in forms which are totally alien to socialism. Democracy brings the masses into political participation, but bourgeois democracy only represents the domination of the capitalist class. Similarly, the socialization of labor in large workplaces and the planning of massive corporations lays the basis for a socialist society. But under capitalism, this socialization of labor only leads to mega profits for the bosses and alienation for the individual worker. These forms will not automatically lead us to socialism. They must be transformed by a revolution. They are important not because they render the idea of socialist revolution superfluous, but because they demonstrate that it is both necessary and possible. Reformers have abandoned the whole idea of socialism. Rather than being some sort of innovation, in fact, reformism ends up as reheated idealism. If you throw out any criticism of capitalism, you end up accepting the status quo. This means accepting the exploitation of workers, as long as the bourgeois claim to be in any way politically progressive. Ultimately, this means denying that exploitation or even the working class itself even exists. The early reformists claimed to be neutral theorists, abandoning the so-called prejudices of Marxism. Instead of representing one class, they claimed to represent all of humanity, putting forward abstract moral arguments. But as we live in a class society, people who claim to have no bias are simply biased towards the status quo by covering up its realities. In abandoning socialism, reformism has no other option but to defend capitalism. So we see that while pretending to be simply an innovation of Marxism, reformism is a wholesale attack on Marxism and, taken to its logical conclusions, prevents any chance at socialism. Nearly there. Reformists are not capable of putting together a fully formed theory explaining society as Marxism does. Instead, reformism tries to solve one part of capitalism at a time and attack one small element of Marxism after another. The method and outcomes of reformism clearly differ from those of the socialist movement. They divert the working class away from class struggle and push the labor movement down bourgeois paths. Because utopian socialism, which preceded Marxism, based the struggle for socialism on moral justice, it had an idealist philosophy. It was important in the development of the socialist movement, as it gave theoretical expression to the early symptoms of the class struggle under capitalism. But as the class struggle developed and the contradictions within capitalism became clearer, these theories were no longer sufficient. Scientific socialism was required. Contrary to the idealists of the 19th century, reformism in the 20th century was a clear step back, an attempt to put workers' movement back in the box. However, just because Marxism is correct does not mean that reformism, anarchism, and idealism will automatically be proven wrong to the majority of the people. A revolutionary party is still part of the rest of society and comes under pressure from dominant bourgeois ideas. This pressure does not come from bourgeois ideas being correct, but from real social conditions. A theoretical battle must be constantly waged against these ideas which are alien to the movement. The only way to guard against this is to educate the whole party in Marxist ideas and practice. Now, looking ahead to what's going on right now, the objective factor, the revolutionary potential of society, is clearly in place. You can see this from the speed in which events are happening. You had the BLM uprising last year, which was practically an insurrection, where 10% of the US population engaged in an insurrectionary movement. In Myanmar right now, the people are waging a heroic struggle against the military coup to implement democracy. In Bolivia last year, they overthrew a right-wing coup for a movement of workers and oppressed people. In France, they had a general strike at the beginning of last year against pension reforms. In Poland, they're on the streets against the abortion laws coming in from the right-wing government there. South Africa are currently engaged in a general strike. India have currently got the biggest strike in human history of 250 million people fighting against the farmers' laws coming into place. The splits in the ruling class are clear. Just look at what's going on in the UK right now. You've got differing parts of the Tory party with differing objectives. You've got the splits within the monarchy. You've got the fact that the workers are coming out into the streets against fire and rehire, for the Black Lives Matter movement, for the climate movement, for the Reclaim the Streets movement. The middle classes are beginning to join them because they're seeing that their livelihoods are being destroyed. This pandemic has shown how capitalism cannot deal with the crises that lay before us. But the need for a revolutionary party has never been um, more needed than it is now. The objective factor for revolution may be in play and may be advancing, but without a revolutionary party, without a party that is clear in Marxist ideas and practice, we will not be able to harness the energy and the anger that is rising within society and direct it towards revolution, the overthrow of capitalism, and the implementation of a socialist planned economy under workers' control.